is drafted like a statute and meant to be interpreted by people who work with statutes, there's much less room for agency than in a regime like or in a Quebec or in James Bay agreement.
Let's see. Well, thank you for sharing with us your paper, and I like very much reading it, and I like especially the part at the beginning when you were talking about how Declaration of Rights and the like can be, if they're taken too much as a written artifact, can have a lesser meaning, and I would even have liked more about this. And I don't know if maybe I was not able to make the connection through the parts, but I felt that there was a deep and profound thing in the praxis of human rights, or is it? You talk about human agency and interactions, and it seems to be two sources, and it's not clear how they feed on each other that much. But I'm not familiar with. I guess you have. I haven't read all your articles, and there was a small point maybe that I could make, or just a suggestion, something that hit me when you were talking about at the beginning. There was the word. Well, in French, it's au commencement était le verbe, and I thought that this could relate nicely to Jean-Guy, and since it's in French, and verbe talks about more human agency, and it's a way of seeing, like, it relates a bit to logos.
Thank you. The question that you put perhaps shows a structural weakness in the paper. I thought as I was putting the pieces together, how could I exemplify in the paper the character of my read of the character of Jean-Guy as human being and scholar, and the common thread is the relationship between action, agency, and text, because the cricket exemplifications are all exemplifications of people remaking a text, and evangelicalism is all about the relationship of practice and ritual to text, and the reference to things like Sale of Goods Acts and commercial practice, which was one area that John Meehan also was quite engaged in early in his career. And so I was trying to have the pieces of the paper be about legal pluralism, because here we have competing normative orders that are competing for our understanding and our attempt to watch the relationship between feeling oppressed and subjected to external authority, and the empowerment of the person to take whatever is projected as external and turn it into a hypothesis for action which is given by the person. And maybe I need to make that more explicit in the introduction, that the various chapters are actually consciously chosen to show these different dimensions of Jean-Guy's own career.
What, I'm just going to start with Nancy and then Mary. Oh, that's okay. Nancy and Mary.
I like very much the comparison that you make between law and legal pluralism with the different religious approaches to the Bible. When I was reading your paper, however, I was missing a comparison with the theology of liberation approach. Because in the theology of liberation, as in your critical legal pluralism, people are agents of the faith. And if your point is to make agents are not subjects out of people, it would be a nice link to mention the grassroots movements that take place in the theology of liberation.
You're absolutely right. But, you know, can I say, we're prisoners of our own history. And when I was thinking of how to exemplify this, Luther and Calvin were closer to my own history than Cardinal Newman and liberation theology. I will do some more research and see if I can get that element in there, because the response is exactly the same. It is the capacity to refuse to let the other define the meaning of a text. Absolutely.
I found this really helpful and interesting on all kinds of levels. One of the things that conceptually I found interesting is that I've been doing a lot of stuff around my sort of group rights versus individual rights, and how the people who are in the majority culture don't understand that that their environment is as cultural as is the people in the minority groups. And so there's been a false dichotomy set up between the individual and the group, because the people in the large group don't conceptualize that they're part of the group. Sort of, it's a bit rough, but anyway, what I found interesting here is that and most, and at least I'm not deeply schooled in the literature of pluralism, but a lot of it is also setting up different pluralities, groups. But it seems to me that your analysis, in a very interesting way, is saying that the pluralism is a quality of itself. And so you're back to the individual in a way that that moves to a relational concept rather than a group concept. So it's an interesting bridge, I think, between that gives some deeper insight into how the sort of the rights of the individual and the rights of the group is in fact a false dichotomy.
Two things that I wrote down here, which also I need to work with a bit in the text, two things that I need to work with in the text. And I've written about it in another context, but need the reference back, is that when we have this big debate in Quebec about reasonable accommodation, right, it is interesting that all kinds of accommodations that are just built into our legislation for the majority are never perceived of as accommodations. They're just simply perceived of as, well, that's intelligent legislation because that way it's going to work, right? But wherever exactly the same kind of thing is put onto the table as how do we make this legislation work for everybody in our society, if you're not in the majority culture, it is seen as somehow exceptional and somebody has to bend for you. When we do exactly the same thing for the majority culture because it's normal. So I have to get that idea onto the table, that the dominant order is constructed out of exactly the same timber as every other order. It's just that it dares not speak its name that way. So that's a very good and an important point. And the second point, which I took a note on, is